Okay, welcome to the WPIAL Blitz Show, our first live edition. Oh my gosh, Bruce Badgley, Ian McMeans, man, we are back, aren't we?
We are back. It is so exciting. We are live. This is awesome. The 2023 football season is right around the corner. There are scrimmages happening this weekend. The games actually kick off next week. This is awesome.
Yeah, I tell you what, it's pretty incredible. When we think back when we started, the WPIAL Blitz Show, and now, I mean, we combine with fresh set of downs, and we do the championship edition, and we take it all the way from preseason, which is what obviously is going on today, until Cumberland Valley. I tell you what,
You
I
almost
was
said
thinking.
Hershey, didn't you?
I know, but I think back about all these great times that we've had, Ian, and I can't thank you enough for bringing this District 3 guy along for the WPIAL ride every year. It is so wonderful for me that when we get into the state championships, that I can talk football with guys. Like for me last year, getting to know John Ladon, and having him on the show, watching his games. I broadcast both the semifinal and the final for NFHS Network, and John was quite a character. That was probably my highlight of last year was getting to know John. What are some of the things that you've taken away from since we started the show?
Yeah, the thing that always astounds me is how gracious people are with their time. Like, we started this show in 2020 when people couldn't go to games, kind of just as a way to get more information out there to people about what was happening. And obviously I'm a sort of amateur historian and just love high school football in general. So it was right
You're
up my
much more
alley.
than an amateur historian, pal. Okay.
It was right up my alley of, hey, let's talk high school football for an hour or so on a Monday night. And now we're live and people can join us and ask us questions in the chat, which is amazing. But I think one of the things that's been really cool for me is to see how people that we've interviewed have grown over time too. That, like, our first year we interviewed Mike Colati, who was the head coach of Elizabeth Forward, took them to their first championship game ever. And now this year he's the head coach at Mount Lebanon. He took over for Bob Palco, who retired 2 years ago after Pine Richland had their whole kerfluffle of changing head coaches and all that. Seneca Valley went in and beat them, and we interviewed Ryan Lemeyer, who was Seneca Valley's offensive coordinator. And now Ryan's the head coach at Central Catholic with a loaded team that's one of the favorites in 6A. So it's really cool to see these guys that, like, we interviewed a couple years ago now taking these big time premier jobs. And it's like, oh, hey, I know that guy. I talked to him. It's really cool to see them kind of work their way up the food chain.
It is. And for me too, since I do a lot with like the Big 33 and the Coach Association, the East-West games and what have you, these coaches that we've interviewed, they know me when we see each other on the sideline. In fact, it's great, when we actually get to meet each other in person, when it becomes very meaningful. And that's the best part is, like, wow, this stuff is just enormously meaningful. And it's just been an enormous amount of fun. And wow, we've got a lot to get to, so you've got control, my friend. But I just was going through looking at some of our championship shows or whatever like that, and what great memories. And you just do a fantastic job, my friend. So why don't we get started?
Yeah, I actually was able to throw something together here. So as normal, we'll have some visual aids tonight as we work through and talk through everything coming here. So why don't you talk about first on board here, new sponsor for the season with Go MVB.
Go MVB. I'll tell you what, I got to know Go MVB. I've been doing a recruiting podcast this off season, and Frank Barone, the owner and president of Go MVB, I'll tell you what a great guy and what a great program Go MVB has. It's basically a public relations firm for high school athletes. 85% of Go MVB users actually get college offers, and it's not just for football, it's for all sports. We've got some very special offers that we'll talk about, but It is a public relations firm that basically molds an athlete's profile through social media, provides press releases, does all of their videos, and maintains a really positive social media presence, which right now is so very important. And considering now high school athletes are really competing against college athletes for scholarships with the portal out there, it is very important that a high school athlete has everything that they can have to be successful, especially out on social media, where 90% of the coaches right now are recruiting just through social media. So go MVB. They'll hear a lot about it this year, but we've got some great offers too at gomvb.com/SSM special. You get some special rates on Go MVB. So take it away, Ian.
Yeah, the one other thing I'll add too on that is I think it's important to note that now that Pennsylvania has opened the door for high school athletes to have name, image, likeness deals, that having a good, positive social media presence for high school athletes is even more important, because even if you're not a kid that's chasing after scholarships, you never know if there's somebody out there who might be interested in, having you do a car dealership ad or something. I don't know. But the potential's out there. So having a good presence on social media is certainly important.
Great point, my friend.
All right. So last year was a realignment year, and next year will be a realignment year. So just as a quick point of reference for the future of, this show, the rest of the year, for those that may not remember, we've gone from 3 classifications to 4 to 6. And when I refer to classifications, if it's the 6 classification era, I'll refer to it usually with the number and then the letter, versus before that it'll be like quad A, triple A, things like that, versus 3A, 4A, 5A. So just important to keep in mind from a historical standpoint where we were, where we've come from, and where we're going now that we are in our 8th year of the 6 classification era. It's hard to believe it's been that long.
It just seems like yesterday, doesn't it?
It really does. I know. I still think it was a terrible idea, but nevertheless. All right. So let's talk about how Wpial teams qualify for the playoffs, because this is different than how you folks out there in District 3 handle it and how other people handle it across the state.
And why I wanted to get start a show so that I would learn more.
Yes. So from the Wpial standpoint, playoff qualification is all based on how you finish in your conference, which is all just based on conference record. So, more or less, playoff qualifiers are determined by the top X number of teams from any given conference. And you can kind of see here, the one big one to note, though, we talked about it a lot last year, we'll talk about it a lot again this year, is that only 8 teams in 5A qualify for the playoffs. So only the top 2 from each conference are guaranteed playoff spots, and then 2 out of the 3 third place teams get wild cards. But that makes for a really tight race in 5A, and there's some really good 5A teams this year, as there were last year. And there was a really good Penn Hills team missed the playoffs last year. So something to keep an eye on, whereas some of the other classifications, 3A, 2A, 1A, you have 4 or 5 teams from each conference making the playoffs. But 5A is really tight, and 6A, there's only 5 teams, but 4 of them make the playoffs. Seneca Valley was the one that got left at home last year. It's going to be another tight race this year. So just a reminder to kind of keep this in frame of mind as we work through the season, that the early games, the non-conference games, while they matter overall to your record, while they're good experience builders, they don't actually matter for playoff qualification. So let's dive right into it. Talk about 6A. There are 5 teams. North Allegheny is the defending champs. They lost to State College in the PIAA quarterfinals last year. North Allegheny returns a lot of good players, including our 6A player of the year from last year, Kieran Boyd, dynamic wide receiver, returner, defensive back. Have a couple other really good players with D1 offers. Central Catholic absolutely loaded this year. And now, Central under Terry Totten had traditionally run a very run heavy offense. But they have a D1 recruit at quarterback in Peyton Warner, who's throwing to a Pitt recruit at wide receiver, Peter Gonzalez, who's the son of former Pitt and Steelers quarterback Pete Gonzalez. Peter Gonzalez has committed to Penn State, kind of defying his father's alma mater. So now that Central has a coach, Ryan Lehmeyer, who we mentioned at the outset of the show, that's very offensive minded, they're going to open up their passing game a bit, especially with the quarterback they have. And they're going to throw the ball around the yard this year. And they've got a quarterback, they've got a receiver that can do it. So Central is certainly a contender, not only for the Wpial title, but potentially for the state title again this year. And North Allegheny, just with everyone they've got back, is certainly a contender at that level as well. Everyone else kind of a step below this year, I feel like. Mount Lebanon graduated a lot of kids. They're going to start a lot of underclassmen, but they still have two kids that are going to service academies, one going to Air Force, one going to Navy. So, they have some talent on the team. Seneca Valley lost a lot of players from their team last year. Cannon Mac, they return a lot, actually. They return a really good quarterback. And a couple other good players. Linebacker Caden Singleton's name pops to mind. So Cannon Mac snuck into the playoffs last year at the very end of the year, but then played eventual champs North Allegheny to like a 7-0 game in the playoffs. So
yeah,
could be a team to keep an eye on this year. With arguably one of their best teams ever at Cannon McMillan. But it's going to be a tight race for those last two playoff spots here. But I really think North Allegheny and Central Catholic are kind of head and shoulders better than everyone else.
so is this the year that Central Catholic, I mean, we've been talking about them here. I think obviously since we started the show, and it seems really that they've had, a difficult time kind of, meeting expectations the last few years. So now with the new coach, do you think that that's going to be, what's going to kind of get it? Obviously, coaching needs talent, but do you think that the coaching change was what Central Catholic needs to get back to the top echelon?
Yeah, I think it's definitely time, the way football's moving with, opening things up more offensively. I mean, Terry Totten was a great coach, very decorated, won Wpial titles, won state titles. And I mean, I think Central's pedigree speaks for itself, 20 straight playoff appearances, in the championship game, 9 of the last 10 years. When we first started the show, they won it in back-to-back years in 2019 and 2020. In that 2020 year, they had a team that I don't know if they could have hung with that St. Joe's prep team, because that was a really good prep team that year, but they kind of got a raw deal in the playoffs of, they had to forfeit their state playoff game because of COVID.
Yeah.
And never really even got the chance to play. And then the last 2 years they lost in the championship game to Mount Lebanon, who went on to win the state title, and then to North Allegheny. But the other side, the last 2 years, Peyton Warner had been starting at quarterback since his sophomore year. So, young players growing into their roles. They've been playing a lot of underclassmen for a few years. And now that those kids are all seniors, I think they're poised to take that next step. But I mean, North Allegheny won the title last year and brings back pretty much everybody. So it's hard to pick against North Allegheny, but I mean, Central's right up there too. I mean, they're both really good teams.
Right. And I think that it's the state's a much better place and really strong Wpial representation in 6A. And listen, just a quick shout out from someone from Woodland Hills Football Network, who's
oh yeah, those guys are great,
joining us there. So they appreciate the coverage that we give. And so
well, just wait, we're getting to 5A. We'll talk about you guys.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. A little typo here on my part. My bad. I pulled the Penn Live rankings. They came out early this year, so we can actually talk about Penn Live's preseason rankings a little bit.
Thanks, Brian Linder. Thanks.
Yep. And Eric Epler too, right?
Eric, yeah. I mean, yeah, those are my guys.
Yep. So, and as much as we tease those guys about their Eastern bias, like I do appreciate all the work they put into it. It's not an easy venture to try and rank teams statewide. But I think kind of where they have the Wpial teams is probably about right. That Central and North Allegheny are among the top teams in the state, and you could go either way. North Allegheny is the defending Wpial champs. They beat Central last year. Both teams bring back a lot of players. So it could go either way. I think they're neck and neck. Garnet Valley was a really good team last year. Obviously, St. Joe's Prep, they are what they are. And actually, I got an email from a guy from your neck. Well, not your neck of the woods, but he was from like District 1 or District 12, somewhere around there. Or he might have lived in District 1 and his kids went to school in District 12. And he was like, you called St. Joe's Prep the New York, New Jersey, Maryland All-Star team. And I laughed for 5 minutes because that's spot on when I was like, okay, but and I'm just,
It's
like
amazing the outreach that the show
we've always said on the show, we're here to be informative and entertaining. And it wouldn't be entertaining if we didn't throw in some little jabs at people every now and then.
Yeah, just looking at the top 10 there, I'll tell you what, that is, that's not, I guess it's a smattering of not the usual suspects. I mean, obviously you've got the, the traditional things. Garnet Valley's been obviously a top team here over the last few years, but well, I tell you, Parkland, Central Bucks West, Nazareth, Coatesville, typically not the teams that start the season with high expectations. I mean, they kind of play into, a top ranking as the season goes on, but I tell you what, I like how that looks. I tell you, I've been very impressed with Harrisburg in the offseason. State College, they were very impressive last year.
They had a freshman running back who was really good, and they split with Harrisburg last year, I think, right? They beat Harrisburg in the regular season, then lost to them in the semifinals.
That is absolutely right. Yeah, I was at both games. So, I think 6A, obviously 2 through 10. I think that's going to fluctuate kind of wildly throughout the year, but it clearly St. Joe Prep with so much coming back from a overpowering championship team. So,
yes. All right. So since we have some commenters from our friends at the Woodland Hills Football Network, who have always done a great job covering Woody High, let's talk about 5A. 5A with only 8 teams making the playoffs has some really good teams to watch out for. The Allegheny 6 Conference, Bethel Park won this conference last year, was the top seed in 5A, but it was Upper St. Clair that wound up going to the Wpial championship game. St. Clair brings back a lot this year. They used 2 quarterbacks last year, both Julian Dahlem and Ethan Hellman. Both of them come back this year, and they got a lot of other talent coming back on that roster. So being that St. Clair went to the championship game last year, I've got them as the favorites. Peters Township has a quarterback in Chris Sabrone who threw for almost 2,000 yards and 19 touchdowns last year, and they did not make the playoffs. So I like Peters is right in the mix too. Bethel has some kids coming back too. Ryan Petrus, who is kind of their all around, leading receiver, third leading rusher, over 1,000 yards of total offense, 17 total touchdowns. So, Bethel should be right in the mix again. South Fayette started a freshman at quarterback last year. So they had some growing pains in the middle of the pack, and South Fayette's a team that that's just a booming, growing community out there that's just had a ton of new development. They were a Double-A team in 2015 before we went to 6 classifications. We're up into 3A and 4A, and are now in 5A, that they've grown so much, over just the last decade as a community of just new residents moving in. But the rapid increase in classification, has brought about some more middle of the pack for the Lions there, but they've got a really good coach in Joe Rossi. They've won titles before, so I have no doubt that South Fayette will be a strong contender as well. Moon and Baldwin just rebuilding after some down years for those 2 teams. All right, on to the Big East Conference, where, probably one of the most talked about players in the Wpial over the last few years has been Gateway quarterback Brad Birch. That he played for Jeanette his freshman year. They went to the state championship game and lost. I think you covered that game against Steel High, right? That was back in 2020.
Yeah, the championship game. I know.
Yeah,
right.
And Brad was hurt for that game and didn't play, and then transferred to Gateway the last couple years, but they really just haven't been able to get over the hump and deliver a championship. But Gateway returns a lot more in this conference than everybody else does. Brad Birch is back for his senior year. They've got some other really good players on that team. Jaquan Reynolds, running back, who has pretty good hands. He's got some offers from some MAC schools. Steve Jenkins, wide receiver, defensive back, who I think transferred from Woodland Hills. So, I think Gateway is certainly a title contender this year. The rest of the conference all lost a lot to graduation. So, while Franklin Regional won the conference last year, Gateway was second. Penn Trafford was third. Plum was a very close fourth. I think Gateway's still a bit higher than the rest of them. That, Gateway's still pretty good, and the other ones lost a little bit, and we'll have to, find guys to fill in. And maybe you find guys who are excellent that fill in that I just don't know about because they haven't played. So it's always possible. Penn Trafford just has such a good tradition of, being in the mix all the time. I really like what Plum's got going. Their quarterback, Sean Franzi, was a bit of a dual threat option last year. They have a couple other players returning. I would be one if I didn't mention that, the community recently suffered a tragedy, that there was a home explosion there. I don't know if you saw that on the
news.
I
did see that.
Yeah.
I did
thoughts
see
and
that.
prayers out to everyone in Plum right now, that I know they're going through some tough times, but I like what they got coming back on their football team. So hopefully they're able to, to pull together as a community, because that's definitely a tough thing to go through. Franklin Regional, like I said, won the conference last year, but graduated pretty much everybody. So except for their leading receiver, Aiden Hudock, but everyone else pretty much graduated. So, in a very tight playoff race where only two teams are going to make the playoffs and maybe a third, those margins really matter a lot of just that returning experience. Hempfield got off to a hot start last year, but kind of slowed down once they hit conference play and graduated a lot of their key players too. So, I feel like Gateway certainly is the cream of the crop here in this conference.
Yeah, and you're touching on it here, but experience, and I think at quarterback, probably, the X factor for any high school football team.
Yep. And rumor has it that Gateway is installing a new offense this year where they're going to throw the ball more down the field. So we'll see how that plays out. More. Yes. Yeah. That was the story I read in the paper. So
okay. More.
All right. On to the Northeast Conference. Pine Richland is the defending Wpial and state champions. They did graduate a few players from that team, but they've got a Wisconsin commit up front and Ryan Corey, and just have such a deep bench of players that, and they've shown with what John Ladon did last year there with changing the quarterback mid-season, that if something's not working, they're willing to change things up. But Woodland Hills, I think last year I said that I thought Woodland Hills was a year away. This year they've got a quarterback in Cam Walter who threw for over 1,000 yards last year, a sophomore receiver in Scoop Smith, who's just a dynamic threat all over the field. Their second leading rusher returns. They've got a couple D1 recruits on the offensive line. Woodland Hills might have the best line in 5A. It's
you're talking in the Wpial, not in the state.
Yeah. But it's kind of a shame that they play in a conference with the other top contender and someone's got to win the conference. I mean, I think these two are clearly the best teams, but don't sleep on Penn Hills either. Penn Hills is loaded with talent. And last year they were a team that had a bunch of talent. I mean, their quarterback, Julian Duggar, committed to Pitt. They've got a senior running back in Amir Key who put up over 1,200 total yards and 14 touchdowns. Penn Hills has good players and just didn't seem to put it together last year. And maybe it was the coaching change, right? Because John Ladon had been there and then went to Pine Richland, and Penn Hills had a new coach. But they've got the talent. The question really is whether they can put it together on the field. I mean, they missed the playoffs because they blew a 20-point lead against North Hills is pretty much why they missed the playoffs. And then lost a season finale to Woodland Hills. I think it was 9-7 or 9-6, something like that. So they were close, but it was just, those margins in 5A that 2 losses pretty much does you in. And Shaler, I think, it's worth shouting out to them because over the last decade, Shaler's had 2 losing streaks of over 25 games. Like they've had some really down times.
It's a tough time. That's right.
They have, but they've got they turned it around a little bit last year. They actually beat Woodland Hills last year, qualified for the playoffs a couple times, within the last 5 years. But also they have a senior quarterback in, I'm gonna mispronounce his name, so I'm sorry. Keegan Smetanka, but he threw for over 2,000 yards and 31 touchdowns last year and returns his 2 leading receivers. So he legitimately has a shot to win the Wpial passing title this year. And Shaler, I mean, considering how bad they were a few years ago, like a 5-win season last year is excellent for them. But they're going to throw the ball all over the yard because why not? Like, might as well go for it. And so Shaler could be a sneaky good team in there. And this is kind of the shame of 5A, that a team like Shaler that had been down for so long, now having like a solid team, like, can't make the playoffs, right? Or not that they can't, but like they're fourth on my list of this, where the top two and maybe the third one make it. That with only 8 teams getting in 5A, it's so hard. Whereas some of the other classifications that have a similar number of teams get more teams into the playoffs, and that was basically because of where the PIAA slotted the Wpial 5A champion.
Well, I think it's like where you talk about why there's more in the lower classifications that get in. It's because there's fewer teams in those classifications across the state. Vice versa, there are more 5A teams in other locations across the state, which means that unfortunately that just means fewer. How it trickles down into the playoffs, even in the Wpial, and under the time frame that they've got to get the championships done.
Yep, that's absolutely right. So looking statewide at the rankings, I think, like I said, Gateway, Pine Richland, Upper St. Clair, and Woodland Hills are my top contenders for the Wpial title. I think the Penn Live guys are sleeping on Woodland Hills a little bit. They were a semifinalist last year, lost to Pine Richland in the semis. So, I know Gateway's got the press with Brad Birch and all that, and I don't disagree with having Gateway ranked in the top 5. But I think Woodland Hills deserves a little more love than they're getting. But I don't hate Penn Hills being ranked either. I mean,
I would agree. I mean, I think Penn Hills is like, one of those teams that's just going to rise up this year. There's always a team kind of like last year's Union that just, rises up. I think the Penn Hills is, kind of that team that's just going to kind of vault up there. I mean, and they have the ability to do it. I think that they're in the toughest conference in 5A in the Wpial, and I think that they have the destiny in their own hands. I like Penn Hills a lot this year.
Yeah, I liked them a lot last year. Actually, I went back to our show and I picked Penn Hills to win the Wpial title last year. They didn't even make the playoffs. So what do I know, right? But they beat Pine Richland during the regular season. So like that just goes to show you just how tight everything is. And then Pine Richland went on to win the state title. So anything can happen over a given season. And there's a lot of really good teams in the Wpial this year in 5A.
And I think the dark horse team just in the PIAA, maybe Del Val, but we'll find out early because I think Harrisburg plays at Del Val early on in the season. So we'll find out how good Del Val is. But anyway.
Yeah. All right. So let's talk about 4A, where, I mean, I don't want to spoil things, but there's really 2 teams that are better than all the rest in the Wpial in 4A. Thomas Jefferson is one of them. TJ, constant playoff contender. They have the longest. TJ and Aliquippa have both made the playoffs every year since the mid 1990s. I think it was since 94 or something like that. Just an insane run of success. But Thomas Jefferson, by their program standards, last year was probably a down year. Like, it was the first time since 2011 they lost 3 regular season games, but they still wound up tying for the they still wound up tying for the conference championship in a 3-way split with McKeesport and Laurel Highlands. They made it to the semifinals for the 11th straight year, the 24th time in 25 years TJ's made the semifinals. Like TJ's just so good year after year. And they've got a senior class with quarterback Brody Evans, who threw for almost 2,000 yards and 19 touchdowns. Top receiver Sean Sullivan is back. Leading rushers Elias Lippincott and Aiden Whalen are back. Like, TJ's just loaded this year.
Wow.
TJ is stacked. They've got everybody coming back, and
they've got a lot of answers and not a lot of questions.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, we will get TJ and Aliquippa in the Wpial championship this year. I mean, you'll not to spoil things, but TJ and Aliquippa are the best 2 4A teams this year. It just is what it is. McKeesport was really good last year, but they graduated like their top 5 rushers, and out of their triple option that they run, they pretty much only run the ball. So they've got plenty of talent. Anthony Boyd's really good. He's the younger brother of Bobby Boyd, who was their big rusher last year. He's really talented, but it's just one of those things where they've just got to work new guys in. And McKeesport's system, you can do that. It's plug and play a lot of times. Anthony Boyd averaged 9 yards a carry last year, so like he'll be fine as the leading rusher. He'll be great
against
but
tough competition.
yeah, but nevertheless, I think that when, like we've talked about, when TJ brings everybody back and McKeesport has to work in some new players, like that's where the gap is. Laurel Highlands, we've interviewed their coach, Rich Colasar, twice. He's just awesome and done a fantastic job there at Laurel Highlands. I mean, 2 years ago, they won their first playoff game in school history. Last year, they got to host a playoff game and won their first home playoff game ever. They won a conference title or shared a conference title for the first time ever last year. Just a historic run of success. And obviously Rodney Gallagher, who was their big players, graduated and off to West Virginia, but they have another D1 recruit in Antoine Black coming back this year, who was their second leading receiver last year. So if they can find some pieces around Black, I think they'll be a solid playoff team once again at Laurel Highlands, which, for a team that never won a playoff game before 2 years ago, just making the playoffs is a very solid, a very, very solid accomplishment.
Yeah, it's a process. I mean, you're not going to go from the bottom to the top immediately. I mean, you have to, it is a process, especially in football.
Yeah, absolutely. Latrobe, I think, was one of the biggest surprises last year, that not that they made the playoffs, but that they pulled an upset in the first round and won their first playoff game since 1968. They return a dual threat quarterback in John Wetzel, who's pretty good. They lost their leading rusher, but returned some other decent guys around him. So I think Latrobe, Trinity are right in the mix as well. Trinity got a couple kids transfer over from Washington, I saw. So, Trinity should be a little bit better than they were last year. And then Connellsville and Ringgold at the bottom are just rebuilding. But 4 teams are going to make the playoffs. So really, I think it's TJ McKeesport will definitely make it. And then somewhere between Laurel Highlands, Latrobe, and Trinity. Laurel Highlands and Trinity have had this really weird, back and forth over the last 5 or 6 years, where regardless of how good or bad either one is, they always play each other close. They always play at the end of the year when a playoff spot is on the line for one of them. So it's one of those things where you never know what's going to happen when those two teams square off. But, I think those 2 out of the 3 will make the playoffs, and we'll see what happens. But TJ's just head and shoulders better than everyone this year in this conference. In the greater Allegheny,
maybe in the state. So
I think they're third in the state, second or third in the state.
All right, well,
we'll get to that.
Yeah.
In the Greater Allegheny Conference, you will notice that this one does not have any championship contenders, just because I felt like none of these teams are up to the level of where TJ and Aliquippa are. But Mars last year turned things around by hiring Eric Kasparovich as their head coach. I owe Coach Casper an apology. I've been mispronouncing his name for 3 years, so I'm sorry that I was mispronouncing your name.
Yeah, me too. I mean, that's the way I had always heard it.
So I'm sorry. But his son, Eric Kasparovich Jr., it returns at quarterback and threw for 1,300 yards and 13 touchdowns last year as a sophomore, but he gets his 2 leading receivers back. And when we interviewed Coach Casper last year, he talked about how Mars being such a run heavy program forever, they didn't even have routes that their receivers ran when he came in, and now he comes in and has to institute this passing system. So he's like, the first year is going to be some growing pains, but his focus was on always try to get a little bit better and just don't make the same mistake twice. And we saw it. Mars made the playoffs last year, but I think this year they really take that next step, and I think they win the conference title. And I think Mars is good enough, I think, to make the semifinals, but I don't think they're good enough to be in the championship conversation.
Coach Casper's been a friend of the show, starting over at Pine Richland, and got to know him that year on his championship run there. And it's really great to see what he's doing there at Mars. And I think that they I know with his son at quarterback there, I think that they might surprise some people. That might be another dark horse team this year is Mars there.
You're only a dark horse until you have to play Aliquippa and get pounded. But nevertheless,
Okay.
I mean,
All
the Quips are just so good. They're just so good. They got every. I'll get to them
right.
in a minute. Sorry,
We're
I got
not
to talk
there
about
yet.
these other teams. Yeah, I know. Yeah, Armstrong graduated the Wpial's leading passer, and Caden Olson. He went off to Penn to play football, but his younger brother Ian Olson, along with who was their leading receiver last year, plus two other receivers and their top running back, all returned. So Armstrong's got to figure out who the quarterback is, but they've got plenty of talent around him. Highlands was, they were a 9-1 team last year, and got upset by Latrobe in the first round of the playoffs, but Aaron Randolph comes back. You might remember Aaron being our player of the week once last year, who scored 5 touchdowns on 5 consecutive plays out of the Wildcat offense. So he'll be back. He should probably be starting in the quarterback role this year. They've got a lot coming back around him. And then North Catholic and Hampton. Hampton made the playoffs last year, and North missed the playoffs on the tiebreaker points that you love so much. And it basically boiled down to when North played Hampton, they missed an extra point in overtime. And if North still won the game, but they only won by 6, and they missed the playoffs by 1 tiebreaker point. So if they had won that game by 7, North would have actually, I think it would have gone to a coin flip. But however it was,
coin flips.
Yeah, however it was, Hampton made the playoffs and North missed just barely, which North Catholic being my alma mater pains me a little bit to say. But nevertheless, I will also mention that, spoiler alert, spoiler alert for future episodes of the show. I'm good buddies with the guy who runs the PA football history website, and
Yes.
he's been posting on Twitter, or X, or whatever it's called now. It's Twitter. He's been posting on Twitter every day, like headlines from some day in high school football history. So he's gonna help us out a little bit this year and give us some headlines from history past. Yeah.
Wow,
So
that's fantastic. That's great.
Yes.
We have some great contributors. That's one of them. I think, Chris in 2008 has always been a
he
big
does all of our
supporter
helmet
the
logos. Yeah, he's
program.
awesome.
We really thank, obviously all of our fans, but all of our supporting media members too. I mean, like I said, I can't have a conversation with Eric Epler without him, mentioning the Wpial Blitz show. No, I'm just kidding.
That's great. But after all the hard times we've given him, or I've given him, but the reason I mentioned the history thing though is because my idea was to look back, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years in Wpial history, and 10 years. This is the 10-year anniversary of my alma mater, North Catholic, winning the Wpial and state championship. So that was why I bring it up now. But also, looking back, like 1973. 50 years ago was the year that the Wpial merged with the Pittsburgh Catholic League. So like there's some interesting history there to talk
nice.
about too. So,
that should be fun. I'm looking forward to that this year.
Yeah.
That's great. That's a great get, Ian.
Yes. So, but now onto the thing that is no surprise, that Aliquippa, being the 2-time defending Wpial champions, they've appeared in the championship game for 15 straight years. Went to the state title game the last 2 years. Have gone, back and forth with Bishop McDevitt. Quips won 2 years ago. McDevitt won last year. And Aliquippa is just a tour de force that they bring back so much. Their senior quarterback Quentin Good, junior running back Taquay Hayes, who might be the best junior in the entire state, another running back in John Tracy, and just a ton of other players that are getting recruited all over the place. Shout out to defensive back Brandon Banks, who committed to Yale, who someone in, I think it was the Post-Gazette, did some research, or it might have been the Pittsburgh Union Progress or whatever they're called now, but Banks, they think, is the first Aliquippa player or Aliquippa person to go to an Ivy League school since like the 1980s. So that's pretty darn cool.
Right.
Just a lot of other, Harrison Walker, DeMarcus Walker, Cameron Lindsay. I could just go on. I could name their whole roster. But the big story with Aliquippa this year is not how good they are, because they're going to be fantastic. But it's the fact that their stadium is reopened, and the pit had been a absolute dump for years. It was not called the pit because it was a dump. It was called the pit because of how it's kind of situated in a valley.
Yes.
But but it had been in disrepair for years. The visitor side of the stands had been condemned and closed, and no one could sit there. But they, raised a lot of money. We talked last year. We interviewed their head coach Mike Warfield about the new stadium that was under construction. So after having to play at Freedom High School last year, they now get to return home to the new turf at the pit. And they just announced a sponsorship with Kraft Heinz. So Kraft Heinz made a donation to Aliquippa's football program. So the pit is now Heinz Field, which
Oh my gosh.
so Heinz Field is back in Western Pennsylvania. So now I have to be very careful about not calling the stadium where the Steelers play Heinz Field, because Heinz Field is actually Aliquippa's stadium. So that's
just great stuff. And
Yeah.
I mean, this conference here is always great stuff too.
It
And
is.
obviously,
Central Valley graduated a lot from their team that went to the Wpial championship last year. But Mark Lyons is a great coach, so I have no doubt that they'll be right in the mix again. Montour returns a lot of players from a team that went to the quarterfinals last year. West Allegheny started hot but cooled off, but they've got some guys coming back. They had some injuries last year, cooled them off. So yeah, I mean, there's some good teams in this conference with some good pedigree. It should be exciting, but I think really that Aliquippa, and I put Central Valley on the list just because of their program pedigree. I mean, I think Central Valley is semifinal capable, but I think Aliquippa and TJ really are the top two teams. And the state rankings reflect that. I think this is probably about right, that McDevitt being the defending champions, bringing Stone Saunders back at quarterback. McDevitt probably should be number one heading into the year. Aliquippa should be number two, and TJ should probably be number three. So I have no qualms with that. I think McKeesport might be a little overranked just because of how much they graduated. But once again, their system is so good and so hard to stop that they'll be very good again this year too. I mean, they're also a semifinal capable team.
Bishop McDevitt is my opening game for Penn Live when they open up, and they're going to be as advertised.
Mhm.
Hard to imagine maybe they could be even a little bit better this year than last year, but I think that they maybe have maybe not as many stars, but maybe overall a better team. I mean,
Mhm.
that's hard to believe. But as you touched on, I mean, my gosh, Aliquippa, Thomas Jefferson, Manheim Central, I mean, who played, who lost to Bishop McDevitt in the District 3 championship game last year by a good bit. Really good. John Paul II. Wow. I think that's dead on. I think that they're one of the, hidden gems in 4A, but wow, it is so top heavy, with those top four teams there. In 4A across the state. And don't forget my friends up there at Jersey Shore too.
Yeah. The other thing we talked about too a lot last year was how 4A is really the statewide classification, that like 5A, 6A are really heavy towards like the Eastern, the D1, D3, District 12 teams just have so many big schools. But really 4A is where you start to get that true statewide representation of, teams from across the board. And I think you see it here. You've got 1, 3, 7, 12, 11, 4. You have five different districts represented in the top 10. So
and you have a good mixture of boundary and non-boundary schools. I think that I think it 4A and like I said, I mean, you touched on it. It really is like the classification for football in the state of Pennsylvania.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And honestly, we'll talk about this probably next week when we get into like our rankings. But since we did our top fives, like
got a lot of pub on that, man.
I would line up Aliquippa and TJ against any team in the Wpial, Central Catholic, North Allegheny, whoever, and I would give them a puncher's chance. Like,
see, and you kind of scoffed at me when I said, "Oh, we need to do a top 5 regardless of classification." Now I think you're seeing the value in that.
I am, although I almost wish we'd do like a top 5 big schools and top 5 small schools, because there's some really good small schools out there that just because they're small don't get as much press.
I get it. It.
But I think Aliquippa and TJ, I think they could line up and go toe to toe with anyone. I think they're that good.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
McDevitt too. Like, I mean, maybe not McDevitt with like a St. Joe's prep, but like, I
Well,
think,
they go up against LaSalle week 3. LaSalle
yeah. Well, and
College.
I think you could line up McDevitt against like a Harrisburg, and McDevitt would have a puncher's chance against him.
I would think so.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
So
Right.
looking at both teams, I would love to see that game,
Yeah, yeah.
but hint, hint, nudge, nudge, wink, wink there, Jeff and Cal. I mean, we'd love to see that game, but
Yeah.
not going to happen.
All right.
They used to play all the time.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, they're like right down the street from each other, right? More or
Well,
less.
no, now McDevitt moved a little bit.
Oh, okay.
They're not really outside of town, but not as close as they used to be. That's for sure.
Okay. Well, moving down to the bottom half of the classifications, but we like to try and give, on this show equal weight to everyone because there is good football being played in the lower classifications too. They're just the schools aren't as big, and we like to try and give shout outs where they're due here too. Bell Vernon being the defending state champions, pretty clearly head and shoulders better than everyone else in 3A this year. Spoiler alert. But the Allegheny 6 conference, I actually think is a really fascinating one this year because Freeport kind of ran away with it last year, but then Shadyside kind of came out of nowhere and made the semifinals. They upset Elizabeth Forward in the quarterfinals. Both of those schools graduated some players, and East Allegheny returns a lot this year. So I think it's going to be a pretty tight mix between those three at the top. And then at the bottom, 4 teams out of this conference are going to make the playoffs just because of how the playoffs work, right? 4 teams are going to make it. That last year, Deer Lakes made it for the first time since 2015. And then you've got Knock and Valley. Like, you got 3 teams at the bottom that, other than Deer Lakes making it last year, like, have barely made it at all in a decade. So, potential for some good storylines there. Deer Lakes brings back their senior quarterback, Derek Burke, and along with a couple other pretty good players. So I think Deer Lakes is probably in solid position to make the playoffs again, but Knox 1-9 record was a little bit deceiving because 4 out of their 9 losses came by 10 points or fewer, and they started a sophomore at quarterback. They started I think a couple other sophomores at receiver and running back. So they've got some good players coming back from 1-9 is 1-9, but 1-9 where you're getting blown out versus 4 out of your 9 losses being by like 10 points or less. Like, they weren't that far off for being a very young team. So
Sure.
I think this could get interesting here if a couple teams start beating each other. Bell Vernon, once again, cream of the crop in the Wpial. Obviously the defending state champions, and bring back pretty much everybody. Quentin Martin, who's a Penn State commit, is an absolutely outstanding running back. He was injured a little bit last year, but still put up almost 1,300 rushing yards, over 400 receiving yards, 30 touchdowns. Jake Gettico also returns at running back after putting up like over 700 yards and 16 touchdowns. And their quarterback, Braden Locks, committed to Eastern Michigan to play tight end. He plays defensive end, was involved in that goal line stop at the end last year in the state championship game. So they've got like everybody coming back. And everyone else graduated people. So
that's a
Bell Vernon
recipe to repeat.
Bell Vernon is just head and shoulders better than everyone this year. Elizabeth Forward was a really hot team last year for a while, kind of skidded at the end, lost to Bell Vernon in week 9, which cost them the conference title, and then got upset by Shadyside Academy in the playoffs and graduated a number of seniors. So I think they're still good, but not as good as last year. Mount Pleasant brings back some players, so they'll be right in the mix again. They were a playoff team last year. Southmoreland, the record doesn't show it, but considering they didn't make the playoffs at all from 1979 till 2019, like, just making the playoffs for the 3rd time in 4 years is a pretty big accomplishment for them. So shout out to the Scotties for that. And they overcame some adversity last year too, to make the playoffs, and their quarterback and wide receiver both return. Their wide receiver Ty Keffer led the Wpial in receptions last year and had over 1,000 receiving yards. So even though they didn't win a lot of games, like Southmoreland's got a lot coming back, so I think they're right in the mix for the playoffs as well.
Like you touched on the fact of they've got some talented guys coming back, and it's bad that obviously that it's so top heavy there with Bell Vernon, because a lot of times it seems like that when they've got good talent coming back, and it just kind of dampens the enthusiasm that they can kind of move on when they're such a prohibitive favorite.
That's true. Although that being said, like, definitions of success are different for different teams, right? Like, sure. Southmoreland's never won a playoff game, so if they can win a playoff game this year, like, that's a historic success for their program.
Right.
So I think them just being able to win a playoff game potentially would be a tremendous success. Southmoreland and Mount Pleasant are neighboring communities and are huge rivals. So like Southmoreland, if they can beat Mount Pleasant, who's had their number for years, would be another feather in their cap. So finally, the Western Hills Conference, Avonworth went to the championship game last year. They bring back I'm going to mispronounce this name too, Brandon Biagarelli, who's a Bucknell commit at running back, and have some other replacements to make of guys that graduated. I still think Avonworth is the best team in the conference, but I think I think the gap has shrunk. That Avonworth last year crushed everybody. I think this year they're still the best, but it's a lot closer. West Mifflin returns their top 2 rushers. So I think that West Mifflin's a team potentially, like I said, Bell Vernon's the cream of the crop. But after that, like, someone else has to make the championship game, right? So like Avonworth's a contender, West Mifflin's a contender, maybe one of those other teams from the Allegheny Conference is the contender.
Yeah.
That someone else is going to make the championship game. And South Park brings back their leading rusher. Beaver's got some guys to replace. Hopewell started a freshman at quarterback last year, so the gap between Hopewell and the playoff teams was pretty great. But nevertheless, like, when you start a freshman at quarterback, there's going to be some growing pains, and you hope that you see that progress. So, I think Hopewell can take that next step forward and potentially be in the mix this year. But I still think the top 4 are the top 4.
Yeah.
All right. So my championship contenders, I think Bell Vernon, I think the rankings are right here. I think Bell Vernon is head and shoulders better than everybody. And then you kind of go from there to see who else is going to potentially make the championship game. I think Avonworth is the best in their conference, but don't sleep on West Mifflin. Any one of those teams from the Allegheny Conference could come out and kind of separate themselves. But there's a lot of unknowns. There's a lot of teams that were kind of 500-ish teams last year that return a lot of players, and then there's a lot of teams that were really good last year that have to replace some because of graduation. So should be a wide open race for second in 3A.
I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, I think that it's Bell Vernon and everybody else this year. And I think that anybody 2 through 10, I think you could basically just reshuffle the deck. It's probably those same 9 teams, just in different order when we come down to the end of it. All of them very good. And all another division that we like so much, the fact that it's really a representation of the state very well. When you look at District 11, District 12, District 7, District 3, a lot of fun when you can get the whole state involved in a particular classification.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, moving on to 2A, which we'll talk about the Wpial a little bit, but statewide is an open and shut case. But in the WPIAL, Steel Valley is the defending champions. They've got some really good players coming back once again. Cruz Brookins, who is their do-it-all quarterback, graduated. He's at Pitt now. He's drawing rave reviews from defensive coordinators already as a true freshman. But they've got 2 running backs, the Barksdale brothers, Donald and Duran, who can absolutely fly. And Steel Valley likes to run the ball. They're going to run the ball a lot, and they've got a lot of talent coming back on that team. I think they're head and shoulders better than the rest of this conference. Sarah Catholic, Quadir Stribling split time at quarterback last year. He'll take over the job this year, but they graduated a lot of players in the last 2 years from that team that went to the state championship game, which was a really good team. but they've lost a lot to graduation over the last few years, so they've got to kind of restock their shelves. But Sarah's still a very strong playoff contender, and I think they make the playoffs. After that, though, this conference fascinates me. It gets really interesting in the middle of the pack here because Burrell made the playoffs the last 2 years. Returns their leading rusher who ran for over 1,400 yards and 16 touchdowns. And then you've got an Amani Christian team who their head coach, Leroy Johnson, used to be the head coach at Stowe Rocks. Amani's knock, I guess, is that they have an incredibly small roster. So like a couple injuries really does them in. But they've also got like a sophomore in David Davis who scored 17 touchdowns and has a Penn State offer. Deshaun Burnett has a Penn State offer along with a couple other offers. That Amani's got guys. They've got dudes that are really good.
I saw him like 7-on-7 up at Penn State. I mean,
yeah,
glaring when you look at like, wow.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah, they've got some dudes. The problem is they only have like 20 kids on their roster. I might be making that up. I might be a little more, but like they're just not a deep team. So like 1 or 2 injuries and they're really hamstrung.
Yeah, but that's the case with most, in the 2A and 1A classification across the board. Yeah. I mean, injuries can be such a determining factor in success or failure in the season.
That's true. Yeah. So I think like Amani's a fascinating team. Burrell's a fascinating team. None of them are, well, Amani could be an interesting matchup for Steel Valley with their athleticism and talent, but I don't think Amani's big enough on the lines to contend with the monster Steel Valley has up front. But nevertheless, I think that the race for kind of who potentially gets a home playoff game, finishes third, finishes second, is really fascinating in the middle of the pack. Ligonier Valley graduated a couple players, but they have a run heavy team too and return some guys too. So
yeah,
they should be all right. Apollo Ridge should be in the mix once again too. And last year, some of these teams kind of beat each other also. That there was some question marks coming down to the last week of the season as far as who would make the playoffs here. So it's going to be an interesting run again for just who makes the playoffs.
Yeah, and I don't think Ligonier Valley expected to be paired in the same division as Steel Valley when they came into the Wpial.
Probably not.
So, yeah. But anyway, but that's what I mean. I mean, sometimes it kind of spoils expectations when you have that, 800-pound thing sitting on your back in your conference there, but it is. But just as you talked about, I mean, there's a process in achieving those goals, but usually it's winning your conference is number one, and it's really tough when you're looking up at Steel Valley every year.
Yes, it is. All right, the Century Conference, I have to put an asterisk here by Washington because they lost some guys to transfers to other schools, but I don't know who all is back because I've heard different things about different players being listed either on their roster or not on their roster. So if everyone is back that I think is back, I think Washington is capable of making a very deep run. But if some of those guys transferred and I just didn't see it, then there might be a little bit of an asterisk there on Washington, and we'll see how it plays out. And Washington was a team last year that, kind of stumbled through the regular season a little bit, but then in the playoffs, they upset Sarah Catholic in the first round. And it was like, whoa, where'd this team come from? So they've, like I said, if everyone's back that I think is back, they're certainly in the mix. But Keystone Oaks might have one of their best teams ever. They've got a D1 commit in Clinton Robinson who's going to Syracuse. He made a bunch of big plays, including pretty much single-handedly winning their playoff game last year. So KO definitely right in the mix. Last year, KO lost 3 games and 2 of them were to Stowe Rocks that were both like 50-0. But and one of them was to Bishop Canavan in non-conference play. So
wow.
but KO is a good team, should be right in the mix. Excuse me. Stowe Rocks, though, they were a top contender the last couple years.
Yeah,
they lost like 13 seniors to graduation, which on a 2A program is like your whole starting roster.
Yeah.
Like their top 6 rushers all graduated. They lost a lot of receivers. They lost pretty much everybody. So I think Stowe Rocks takes a step back to the middle of the pack this year. And Brentwood, rebounding from a 1-win season a few years ago, is on the way up, but I don't think they're quite good enough yet to get there. But yeah, I think Stowe Rocks takes a bit of a step back. Over to the Midwestern Conference, Beaver Falls has moved down to the 2A in 2020 and has reached the Wpial championship game every year, but they've lost the last 2. So once again, right at the top of the pack of potential contenders. They've got some pretty good running backs returning to their backfield. Mohawk, though, I think is a really interesting team. You might remember last year they had a hazing investigation at the beginning of the year, had to cancel their first few games, but they've got their starting quarterback and top 3 receivers all coming back. So Mohawk's potentially a team, and like they like to throw the ball. Their quarterback threw for over 1,000 yards last year. So I think Mohawk potentially takes a step forward and could potentially challenge for a top spot in the playoffs, a home playoff game, things like that. And Neshannock was a semifinal team last year, but lost a lot to graduation. So I think they kind of take a step back. The one I've got my eye on, though, is Elwood City. Because,
really?
Well, and here's why. And this is why we talk about different definitions of success, right? Elwood City entered last season with the longest losing streak in the state.
Right. They did.
Yep. So their week 2 win snapped a 27-game losing streak that dated all the way back to 2018. And then their week 6 win ended a 26-game conference losing streak. So like they went 2-8, but those 2 wins were incredibly meaningful for their program, right? And they've got some young players that have been, now they're entering like their sophomore, junior, senior years that have been starting for a couple years as they tried to rebuild that program. And they've taken their lumps, and I think the arrow's pointing up for them. I don't know if they're quite there to get into the playoffs yet, but they're trending in the right direction, right? When you go from 27 straight losses to winning 2 games, like that means something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it sure does. And just like you said, the progression aspect of it, considering, the division that they're in, it really gives them a lot of hope. I mean, that,
and they're not good enough to contend with Beaver Falls
correct. But I mean, in the guys that they've got to leap over there between, obviously Mohawk and Riverside, hey, they're creeping up the list.
They are. And it's one of those things where like, Neshannock graduated almost all their starters, and I just don't know what they have behind them because those guys didn't play last year. So, maybe Elwood's guys that, they've taken their lumps, but they have some experience. Maybe they can get over the hump. Maybe they finally beat Riverside, who's their arch rivals that are, right next door. So it's, I think they're trending in the right direction, and I'm excited to see what happens for them this year.
Yeah, so am I.
Yes. Into a, number 1 is number 1, and then it's everybody else. I think Beaver Falls is a little overrated here. I think Steel Valley is a little underrated from a Wpial standpoint. But I think Steel Valley is the best team in the Wpial. But if I was ranking them, I would probably only rank those 2 as far as the statewide ranks. Westinghouse, once again, getting slept on a little bit after they went to the state championship game last year. But I mean, Farrell's always such a strong contender. I have no problem seeing them, in the top 3 or 4. So, but I think overall, no real issues with who's on the list. I'd reorganize them a little bit, but obviously Southern Columbia is number 1. So it is what it is.
I had a great conversation with Coach Roth at a 7-on-7, and it's very easy to see why they're number 1. He's here for a reason, not because everybody thinks, 7-on-7 is, it's worthless, or, some coaches just don't show any value in it. Coach Roth, we know that they're not a wide open type of offense, but for him, the value is the fact, that they get to the teams that they play against in their conference are going to be whipping it around the yard, and so what does he do? This is how he gets his reps against those types of offenses is through 7-on-7, not only for himself, but his coaching staff. And so they put enormous value on 7-on-7 and how it makes their team better just overall. I thought it was a great conversation. And I really appreciated Coach Roth's time, to talk about. I asked him, I said, why are you here? Your bread and butter is ground and pound. And
Yeah.
to spend the time to go through his philosophy was fantastic. I think that a team on the rise is Trinity. I think that could be a team that, is got the pedigree coming where they could really set themselves up for a good long run. Anyway, and the surprise team last year, Executive Education. Let's see what they do this year.
Yeah, they kind of came out of nowhere in the state playoffs.
It was only like the third year they've ever played football.
Yeah. They're outside of Scranton, right?
They are, and actually, I think Berks Catholic opens with them, so I'm interested to see that game.
Okay. All right, on to 1A, and I've got to say 1A this year is just loaded. I could talk about 1A for an hour alone on this show, so I will try and make it brief because I know we've
we'll
gone for a long time.
It's gonna have. I figured it's gonna have a lot of color in it.
Yeah, but I really tried to trim down the championship contenders to the ones that are cream of the crop. But so this might be a bit of a surprise, so bear with me here. But I know Union won the Wpial title last year from the number 11 seed. They finished third in the conference last year.
Sure. They got hot at the right time. They returned pretty much everyone except for the Stanley brothers. Dual threat quarterback Braylon Thomas is back for Union. Mike Gunn is back. Dane Jonke, Maddox Thompson, Andrew Cartwright. They've got a lot of guys back for the team that went to the state championship game and had a really good showing. And, Union showed last year they were a team that was never going to back down from anyone, right? They went out and scheduled Canton in week 0 when their opponent fell through. And just, played a lot of tight games, but the only game they played that wasn't tight was against Southside Beaver. Southside Beaver absolutely smoked them last year. It was like 35-8 or something like that. And Southside brings back their dual threat quarterback, Brody Omashi, their leading rusher, Ryan Navarra, and Brody threw for 1,100 yards, ran for over 600 yards, had 26 total touchdowns. Navarra had 14 touchdowns and 800 yards. And I think just that firepower that Southside brings back, and considering the fact that they were a semifinal team last year, lost to Bishop Canavan, but really took it to Union, who won the Wpial title. I like Southside's chances this year. I like Union's chances too. Rochester's a really good team. Junior running back Antonio Laurie. Dom Guido returns to that backfield. So Rochester's got a lot coming back from a team that went to the semifinals. I mean, this was a conference last year that put 3 teams in the semifinals. So anyone could win this, right? Laurel won the conference last year and lost to Union by 2 points, I think, in the quarterfinals. So but Laurel graduated some of their top players and has to work some guys in. So to me, that was Southside, Union, and Rochester bring guys back, and Laurel's got to replace them. So that dropped them all the way down to 4th. Northgate's kind of been a program on the rise. We interviewed their head coach a few years ago after they snapped their long losing streak. They've got a kid in Austin Mitchell who's a dual threat quarterback, pretty darn good too. So, I think Northgate, I don't know if they're quite there yet to sneak into the playoffs, but they're trending in the right direction. But the top 3 in this conference all could potentially, be semifinalists again. They're all, but as I'm going to talk about in a minute, there's a lot of really good teams in 1A and other conferences too. So, this could go any which way. 1A is just loaded. All right. Black Hills Conference, Bishop Canavan, won the Wpial title in 2021, lost in the championship game last year. They return a lot. I think they only graduated 4 or 5 seniors last year. Their top 2 receivers graduated though. So Jason Cross, who is a D1 recruit, I think West Virginia. He split time at quarterback last year. He's going to move out to receiver. Cole Olszewski, who's
split time at quarterback last year. He's got a cannon for an arm. Is going to play quarterback full time now. Marquise Carter, their leading rusher, returns. Canavan's loaded. They're the best in this conference. They're certainly a contender to win the Wpial title once again. Fort Cherry, we talked a little bit about them last year. They had a freshman, Matt Sieg, who became the first freshman to pass and rush for 1,000 yards in a season. So we've talked about that 1,000
pretty impressive
1,000
stuff.
club. Yeah. So I'm really excited to see how Matt's career plays out over the next few years. Olsh started last year hot, had a couple injuries, especially at quarterback, that kind of tailed them off. They've got some guys to replace. Burgettstown and Cornell right in the mix for the playoffs also. But, I think Canavan's the cream of the crop here. Fort Cherry and Olsh are solid playoff teams. And we'll see what happens, once they get to the playoffs. But, really, Matt Sieg's such a dynamic and fun player that Fort Cherry is going to be really fun to watch and really fun to root for this year.
Yeah. And, one of the teams that we've kind of seen, has kind of grown up with the show, which has been fun to watch.
Yeah, we interviewed Fort Cherry's head coach the first year we did the show, and he's coaching in the stadium. This named for his grandfather, and his father and grandfather were both head coaches of the program.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's such a cool story to kind of follow too. In the Eastern Conference, I think Clairton is the cream of the crop once again this year. Greensburg Central Catholic won the conference last year, but had some guys graduate. Clairton last year had a really young team, started off slow. They started the year 0-3, but they were the only Eastern Conference team to win a playoff game last year, and I think they carry that momentum into this season. I think Clairton is definitely the best of the group. GCC's got their dual threat quarterback Tyree Turner returning, but lost pretty much all their skill position players around him. I guess Samir Crosby at receiver returns, but Clairton's got a lot of guys coming back who are really good, really fast, and like sophomores and juniors. So Clairton's building for this year and next year. Leechburg lost their D1 recruit in Braylon Lovelace, who's now at Pitt, which I think was Leechburg's first D1 recruit in like 30 years or something like that. So pretty cool for them. They snapped that 32-year playoff drought in 2021. I think they're solidly a playoff team. They've got their quarterback coming back and a couple other guys around him, but not quite as good as they were last year. And then after that, Jeanette, Jeanette's been a wild story that we've kind of followed on this show, right? The first year they won the Wpial title. Then the next year they were like 1-9. And then last year they went 3-7, but got back into the playoffs because their 3 wins were all against all their conference foes.
Right. That Wpial conference stuff.
Yeah. And then but Riverview's got pretty much everybody coming back. So Riverview, I think, could, maybe be in the mix as well, to potentially make a very rare playoff run for their school as well. So it's going to be interesting. I think Clairton's the cream of the crop here, but the race for the other playoff spots should be fun. And then in the Tri-County South, Mapletown won this conference for the first time since the 80s last year, won their first playoff game in school history, but graduated Landon Stevenson, who was the Wpial's leading rusher. So I think they take a little bit of a step back. Monessen finished second last year and returned some really good players this year. So I think they're probably the team to beat. California is always a title contender. Carmichael's is always in the mix. And then the other ones like West Green, Beth Center, Jefferson Morgan, they all kind of beat each other last year. So I kind of didn't know how to sort them out this year, but it's
one's wide open this year.
One's wide open. And the Tri-County South is one of those, they're all small rural schools from down in like Greene County and Fayette County that the Tri-County South has had, I think, one semifinal team in the last, West Green made the semi. Sorry. They've had 2 semifinal teams in 7 years since we went to the 6 classification era. So, they're not contenders for a Wpial title usually. But the fun of it is the regular season, though, because it puts so much more weight on, winning the regular season and making the playoffs. So it's a really fun conference to follow, just because one dynamic player can make such a big difference for some schools. So
and can lead to a conference championship. I think for the Tri-County Conference here, especially, it's probably the most meaningful conference championship maybe of any division in the WPIAL, just because of the grouping of the teams that are here, and that's what makes the conference championship so much fun. And I think the
Yes.
regular season even much more valuable for these teams.
Yeah. And because you have, so many schools that are small, rural farmland districts, they all border each other. So like they're all kind of rivals with each other too. So it's a lot of fun. So, all right, let's talk about rankings. I probably could have included Rochester in my championship contenders, but I really think like Canavan, Southside, Union, Clairton, all should be right in the mix. Rochester, Fort Cherry, Greensburg Central Catholic. Some of those teams are going to lose in the quarterfinals, and it's like they shouldn't be ashamed of that because this is a really deep year for 1A. Just a lot of these teams have a lot of talent coming back. I do have a slight bone to pick with the state rankings just because Union won the Wpial title last year and, does have a lot of their guys coming back. Like maybe it was an upset that they beat Canavan, but they still beat them and they still went all the way to the state title. So I think Union should be a little bit higher here, maybe even higher than Canavan. But like Canavan's capable of winning the state title this year. Union's capable of doing it again. Clairton, I'm glad that Clairton is ranked because that fully recognizes the talent they bring back, even though they were a pretty young team. The one to watch out for though is Southside Beaver, that they've got talent coming back. They were a really good defensive team, and I think they could make some noise.
Yeah, 1A, yeah, across the state, but yeah, I mean, you touched on it really. The 1A classification in the Wpial is really solid, much more than any other district in the state. And I think that there are individually good teams in other districts, but I don't think that there's any other classification that the Wpial has maybe the overall depth of talent with any classification in the state other than 1A. I think that, overall the top teams in 1A are all, going to come from the Wpial in number, but yet Steel High and what they bring back is
with the
just
Irbies,
enormous talent.
Yeah, with Irby at quarterback, Steel High definitely should be number one. That is the correct ranking for them. I'm not going to gripe over Steel High being ranked number one. That's what it should be. But I think you're absolutely right that the depth of the Wpial. We saw it last year. The number 11 seed won the Wpial title. That you could have any of 5 or 6 teams that I'm looking at right now and be like, yeah, they could win the title. Yeah, they could do it. So it's really deep.
Yeah, and 1A is just a little bit more unpredictable just because of the fact that you really an injury here or there could really affect the team so much greater in 1A than most likely other classifications when you have a little bit more guys.
So much fun. It makes it so much fun. I love 1A.
It does. No, 1A is great. For us here in District 3, we've got Steel High. That's about it. But when the state champion, it means a lot. But wow, yes. I'll tell you what, just a great job there, Ian. What a great recap. And like I said, I was looking at our, the championship show before we came on here and just got such great memories of everything. And here we go. We're getting ready to start. What are, some of the things, obviously, besides, the rankings and the teams or whatever like that, what are some of the things that you're looking at in Pennsylvania high school football here in 2023?
Yeah. So I think big picture with realignment coming next year, I think there's definitely going to be a conversation about how the success formula works, or there's going to have to be, because Aliquippa being so good again, they're probably going to accumulate enough of those success points that they might get forced up to 5A, and they had to fight it at the state level last time, and that was a giant mess. I think Aliquippa actually threatened to leave the PIAA if they got forced up to 5A. But they're a 1A size school. It's amazing how they've been able to compete across the board, whatever class they're in. But then you've got schools like Southern Columbia that's still in 2A after winning so many state titles. Bell Vernon moved down from 4A to 3A and won one state title and might win another one. Do they get forced back up? Just some
That's
of the
an
other
interesting
ones.
point, and I didn't think that about that at Bell Vernon. But yeah, maybe that's the team that moves up because of success points. Everybody was pointing a while, but maybe Bell Vernon.
Yeah, and I think beyond that, the PIAA did make some changes to their realignment formula, so I think that might be a factor in how things play out next year as well. One of the big changes that they made was in regards to how schools count kids that go to like homeschool or charter school or things like that. That previously there was some formula where like 10% of them counted or something, but now I think you count
You
all of
count,
them.
yeah, count all of them, and it's
Yeah.
really affects a lot of schools.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that could potentially mix some things up around some districts, as far as where schools get aligned. And obviously it won't affect the on-field play this year, but schools have to submit their numbers in November, December timeframe. And, January-ish, we'll find out what the alignments are. So I think big picture, that's something to keep an eye on, as we move through this year, both what teams are racking up those success points and could get forced up, and just kind of how things are going to shake out with that new formula. I think there's a lot of good storylines, that running back from up in Oil City has a shot at potentially, I think, was it the national rushing record
Yeah,
maybe or something
correct. I
like
mean,
that?
it's pretty impressive.
Yeah, yeah. So that's definitely on the radar. I think at the end of the day, there's always your good storylines that happen throughout the year, and those are always the fun ones to kind of keep track of and be able to tell. But then at the end of the day, you usually get like your usual suspects in the state championship games, and even getting deep into the Wpial playoffs. Aliquip has made 15 straight championship games and returns an absolutely loaded roster, so they'll probably be there again, unless like something crazy happens. But their story this year is they got a new stadium and get to show that off, and maybe they get to host a home playoff game for the first time like ever. So there's some cool things happening there too. And then just what other schools that aren't on our radar right now are going to rise up kind
Yeah,
of out of nowhere. Like Union came out of nowhere last year, and that was a incredible story. That like we talked to James Dodson from the Lawrence County Sports Network, and he was talking about how not only the Union fans, but kind of all of Lawrence County got on board with the story of the Union Scotties and their run to the state championship game. So I think those are the big things I'm looking out for, at least right now, as we get set to start the season.
yeah, you just touched on it there. It's like, who are going to be those dark horse teams? Who are going to be those teams that nobody thought are going to make a deep run, not only in for a district championship, but for a PIAA championship. Those are always the great stories. But this year, in the last couple of years, there haven't been a lot of not the usual suspects. This year, I think it's all about the usual suspects, because I think that the six classifications here, and especially through this last rotation, like the cream has really risen to the top. I don't think,
Yeah.
between last year and this year, I think you really are looking at the usual suspects.
Yeah.
And I think we'll wait another year when they reclassify everybody, and then it'll be again not the usual suspects. But I think this year, I think it's pretty much going to be chalk. I think that the favorites are going to be the ones that we think are the favorites now are going to be the ones that are going to be the favorites at the end of the season. And I think that that's what's going to be the storyline in Pennsylvania football this year. But that's just me.
Yeah. And I think, well, and speaking of teams moving up, I mean, McDevitt could get forced up to 5A. I mean, they've got a state championship under their belt. I think they only have to make the second or third round of the state playoffs to then potentially get forced up to 5A. So, there's that in play as well. But I think you're right in some of these classifications that, like your Southern Columbia's, your Bishop McDevitt's, the question in 4A is really whether it's Aliquippa or Thomas Jefferson. I think 5A is wide open. 5A, I think, is probably the most wide open classification across the board. Maybe 1A also, just because you never know what's going to happen and it's super fun. But like not a lot of people saw Pine Richland coming last year. And,
not when they were like, what, 2-3 or
yeah,
3-4?
right. Yeah. When I remember when we were talking about, our top fives, and I was like, I almost put Pine Richland in this week. And you were like, what are you talking about? They have 3 losses. I'm like, look, they just beat Central Catholic. They just beat North Allegheny. Like, they're the hottest team in the state right now. And then they went on and carried that through the state championship. But I think 5A is really wide open, across the board in the state, in the Wpial and in the state. But yeah, I think you're right, especially like 3A. I think Bell Vernon's the team to beat. 2A, Southern Columbia is the team to beat. 6A, St. Joe's Prep's the team to beat. So I think you're right. The story is a lot of the usual suspects, but then there's also the storylines of who else makes it, right? Like, can State
Correct.
College get over the hump and make the championship game in 6A after they lost to
I
Harrisburg?
mean, you always have those stories, but I like I said, I think that for who the favorites are that'll ultimately make it to Cumberland Valley, I think that a lot of that story has already been written, and even before we start the season, and another, like I said, let's just say I hope I'm wrong. I hope I'm wrong that every single classification has somebody coming out of nowhere who's
yeah. But
and,
the other side of it is sometimes when you have like those 2 behemoths, right? Like, let's take TJ and Aliquippa, right? Like, you want to see them play. I want to see them play for the Wpial championship because I want to know who is better, right? Sure. We're going to watch them all year and be like, well, TJ beat someone 56-7 and Aliquippa beat someone, 54-0. And it's like, I don't know who's better. They're both really darn good. So I think you want to see those 2 teams play. So sometimes there's that 2 trains, 1 track where if you get an upset, it's not as exciting as if you see those 2 behemoths face off.
Yeah, I agree, and the other thing is related to I hope the PIAA does a little bit of something on maybe adjusting, thinking about wild card teams. You touched on the fact you'd like to see some of these teams, get into the playoffs or whatever like that. Well, getting into the PIAA tournament, God, you could look. We had so many bye weeks. In a 16-team tournament. How can we have so many don't have bye weeks? Put more teams in.
Right. Like,
think about wild card teams.
Yeah. What was it? Cathedral Prep in 5A, because there's no other District 10 teams in 5A, basically got a bye to the semifinals. And then
and yet you've got 32 teams down in District 1 slugging it out, over a month. Hey, some at least the teams that play for the championship, all right, at least guarantee them a spot in the tournament if they have a certain amount of teams, like I said, good teams, in the tournament there. And that's District 1. I mean, how can you, with 32 teams, qualify 1 and District 10 with 1? I mean,
right.
What's fair is fair, and I think that you've got to get more teams involved, and that's not only just true in like the 5A or 6A classifications, that should be in the lower classifications, as well. I think it's a little bit easier, in 1A, 2A, to even that out, but I think you can do it in all the classifications, no bye weeks, make sure that you got a full bracket, add wildcard teams, and go.
That would be a lot of fun.
I
think we talked about that at the end of last year when we did our wrap-up show. It was kind of like, what's your like bold wish that you could have if you could change something? And I think you talked about like do away with the districts and just seed teams in the playoffs.
That's what I get a full bracket. I mean, they do it in the NCAA tournament. I mean,
well, and even other states do it. I think like Illinois does it and Michigan does it. That if you qualify, I think because Pat from PA Football History did some research on the Illinois system, and I think they take all the teams that qualify and then list them out by classification. So like 1 year you could be in the 4A playoffs and next year be in the 5A playoffs if like a bunch more teams below you qualify and it pushes you up. That you could be in a different classification for the playoffs, but then you figure out who qualifies, figure out 16 teams in each one, and then bracket them, and then they go. So that's a fascinating model to me.
It is.
Too.
It is a fascinating model. I mean, the PIAA isn't generally known for thinking out of the box, but
That's
we'll
putting it
see.
lightly.
We'll see. We'll see what happens. And I tell you what, this has been the fastest hour and a half in my entire life.
This was so much fun. I am so glad that we're back. It's it's right around the corner. We've got scrimmages happening this weekend. The week 0 kicks off next week. So this is great. So probably do a show the Monday after
the Monday
week 0?
following, first week. So a week from Monday, we'll be back with the recap of like week 1. That's really crazy. And this weekend with scrimmages or whatever like that, I'll be kind of in my laboratory working on something that through Eastern PA football I think has been sorely needed across the state of Pennsylvania. In high school football, going to be working on a little bit something very similar to where you can we're going to hop around and show all the games, really probably from all over the state. Even though we're Eastern PA football, but
it's almost like an NFL red zone kind of.
I can't really say that, but we're calling it goal line. We call
sorry,
it goal line.
Did I violate copyright?
You're not supposed to say Super Bowl. I guess you can't really say red zone, but we're gonna have like EasternPAFootball.com goal line. I think that it's something that I think sports fans will like and want, and we're gonna do a little bit of testing here tomorrow and some of the things there, but just working with the TVU networks on a software package that is just incredible. That we might even have. We'll get. We were talking about like maybe talking to Union to see if we could do some live updates. Hey man, if you go out to a game, we could get you in on a live update with the game that you're watching. I mean, that would be pretty incredible. I mean,
yeah.
So that's technology for you. But anyway, listen, it's great to see you, my friend. And I'll be honest with you, this is the best football podcast in Pennsylvania, I can tell you. And it's because of, the work that you do, my friend, with all your graphics and research and everything like that. I'm just a fan along for the ride and kind of driving the bus here on YouTube. So
it's a lot of fun. Being live this year is really cool. So I'm excited for hopefully getting some engagement and interaction, and we can take live questions during the show now. So that's pretty darn cool.
Yeah, well, we want to thank looks like Woodland Hills Football Network was well represented on there, and I had a few comments, but I'm sure look, first off, this isn't our regular time slot, and second of all, this is the first time that we're live, so I think it was a good start. I want to thank you, my friend, and we want to thank all of our fans out there. We're not only live, but obviously on demand on YouTube there. So I think this is a good show to start here because it'll still work its way through all the way for a good week on demand there. So
yep.
All right,
Ian. A lot of teams still have stuff to be decided. I was kind of trying to put some feelers out there to see with a couple teams, like, who's your starting quarterback going to be, and they're like, oh, we're going to figure it out at our scrimmage this weekend. And I was like, oh, okay. So, some teams that, that we talked about, like, oh, this team graduated a lot of guys, they got some stuff to figure out. Like, they're figuring it out this weekend. So, it's going to be fun to see kind of what those answers are as we get into the regular season too.
Yeah, it sure will. Well, it's great to be back here, I can tell you what. So anyway, listen, thanks, fans. Tell your friends about us, a WPAL Blitz Show, and thanks to our friends at Go MVB, who is our new title sponsor here on the Wpial 7 podcast, Blitz Show, whatever we want to call it. We'll figure out something, won't we, Ian?
The Wpial Blitz Show.
Wpial Blitz Show. Wpial Blitz Show podcast.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks a lot. Hey, we'll see you a week from Monday with a recap of week 1 football. Hard to believe we're actually saying that, but we are. So we'll see you.